7 people were in that room. 7. Not 700, not 70. 7 men who for the rest of their lives would struggle to describe what they saw, because the human eye wasn't built to process it. No camera captured it, no journalist reported it. The man who lost never spoke of it publicly. Not once, not in 40 years of interviews, not in his autobiography, not even on his deathbed. But the 7 who witnessed it, they told their students told theirs, and somewhere in the quiet corners of martial arts history, passed down like a sacred fire, the story survived. This is that story. Rewind. Hong Kong, 1967. His name was Chen Weidong. If you've never heard that name, that's exactly the point. History swallowed him whole after that night. But before it did, Chen Weidong was a figure of absolute terror in the closed-door fighting circuits that ran beneath Hong Kong's gleaming surface. 999 recorded victories. Not tournament wins, not sparring sessions, fights, real ones, the kind that left men on the floor with broken things inside them. Chen stood 6 feet 2. He weighed 235 pounds of trained, compressed muscle, forged over 22 years under the most brutal kung fu masters in Hunan province. He had broken a man's collarbone with a single palm strike. He had dropped a former military boxer in 4 seconds flat. His nickname in the underground circuits was the Stone Wall. And the Stone Wall had a problem. The problem was Bruce Lee. Not because Chen feared him, no, the opposite. Chen Weidong despised Bruce Lee with the specific contempt that only certain men feel toward those who threaten something they've built their entire identity around. Because in 1967, Bruce Lee was becoming famous, not just famous as a fighter, famous as a symbol. His name was spreading through Hong Kong like electricity through water, sparking in tea houses, in gyms, in film studios, in the streets. People were saying things, impossible things. They were saying Bruce Lee moved faster than thought, that his strikes landed before you heard them coming, that he reinvented combat itself. Bruce heard these things, and Chen laughed. He laughed because he knew what Bruce Lee actually was, a showman. A movie actor, a man who performed fighting for cameras and mistook the applause of crowds for the respect of real warriors. 145 pounds, Chen said to his inner circle one evening, swirling tea in a porcelain cup. I have arms heavier than that man. The room laughed. Of course it did. But here's what Chen Weidong didn't know, what none of them knew, because knowledge like this doesn't come from rumor or reputation. It comes from standing in front of him. The meeting was arranged through a mutual contact, a man named Raymond Cho, a respected figure who moved between Hong Kong's visible martial arts world and its invisible one. Raymond had trained under 3 different systems. He knew both men, and he knew with the certainty of someone who has spent decades reading fighters that this confrontation was inevitable. Chen had been making noise. Too much noise. Comments had been passed through intermediaries. A challenge, phrased with just enough indirection to be deniable, had found its way to Bruce. Bruce's response was simple. He named a time. He named a place. A private gymnasium on the 2nd floor of a building in Kowloon, owned by a man who asked no questions and kept no records. And, he said, bring whoever you want to watch. That was the detail that stunned people later. Bruce wasn't asking for privacy. He wasn't afraid of witnesses. He invited them. 7 men came, Chen's people mostly, plus Raymond Cho and one other, a young student of Bruce's named David, whose surname history also lost. They arrived at 9 p.m. The room was lit by 3 overhead lights, wooden floor, high ceilings, the smell of old sweat and lacquered wood. No ring, no ropes, just space. Bruce was already there when they arrived. He was stretching, quietly, almost casually, the way a man stretches before a morning walk, not before a confrontation that could end careers, break bones, or permanently damage the mythology of one of them. He didn't look up immediately. Chen walked in like he owned the floor beneath him. His 2 companions flanked him, both fighters, both large, both wearing the expression of men who expected to be entertained by something brief and humiliating. Raymond Cho stood near the wall. David stood beside him. Neither spoke. Chen studied Bruce for a long moment. "Smaller than I expected," Chen said. Not quietly. He wanted it heard. Bruce finished his stretch, stood up straight, turned around. And here is the first thing every witness remembered about that moment. Bruce Lee's eyes. Not angry, not afraid, not performing calm the way men perform calm when they're secretly terrified. His eyes were quiet, the way deep water is quiet, the way the moment before lightning is quiet. "You have 1,000 victories," Bruce said. His Cantonese was precise, unhurried. "Tell me, which one made you think you understood fighting?" The room temperature dropped. Chen's jaw tightened. That was the tell, the microscopic shift in the face of a man who expected intimidation and received philosophy instead. "This will be fast," Chen said. "Yes, it will." Chen's people thought that was nervousness talking. They were wrong. They didn't know what Raymond Cho knew, what the few people who had seen Bruce in real, unscripted confrontations knew. Bruce Lee didn't fight the way he moved in films. The films were slower. The films were calibrated for human eyes to follow, slowed down so an audience could appreciate what was happening. Real Bruce Lee, actual Bruce Lee, operated at a speed that made professional fighters feel like they were moving through concrete. Chen Wei-dong had spent 22 years building the most powerful striking system his body could contain. Force multiplied by mass. Devastating, crushing, overwhelming power. He had never, in his life, fought something faster than his own thought. He was about to. The two men moved to the center of the room. No referee, no rules discussed. Both understood what this was. Chen settled into his stance, wide, rooted, like a tree that had decided to fight. His hands were enormous. His reach exceeded Bruce's by 7 inches. He used that reach to dismantle men who were his own size. Bruce settled into his stance, and Chen's first companion leaned over to the second and whispered, "He looks like a student." Bruce's feet were light. His weight was forward but not committed, distributed in that particular way that confused opponents, because it suggested both stillness and the instant capacity for explosive movement. His hands were low, lower than any classical system would permit. To Chen's trained eye, this looked like an opening. It wasn't. It was an invitation. And Chen, too proud and too certain, accepted it. He feinted left. A good feint, the kind that had made lesser men flinch and expose themselves. It was the feint that had opened the gap for 40 of his 500 first victories. Bruce didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. He just watched. And something in that stillness, in that absolute, unreadable quiet, made Chen's second companion suddenly stop smiling. Chen threw the feint again, sharper, more committed. Nothing. The room was completely silent. Raymond Cho, pressed against the wall, said later that the air felt different, that the space between the two men felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm when every small hair on your arm stands straight. Chen made a decision. Stop testing, just move. He launched forward, and here is where language begins to fail. Because what happened in the next 4 seconds has been described 7 different ways by 7 different witnesses, and they all agree on the result, but none of them fully agree on the sequence, because it happened too fast for the human eye to file properly into memory. Chen's right hand came forward, full committed strike, every pound of 235 behind it, the kind of punch that had folded men like paper. It didn't land. Not because Bruce blocked it, not because he dodged it in any conventional sense. He wasn't there. One witness said Bruce moved left, another said he moved inside. David, the young student, said later, and he was the youngest with the freshest eyes, he didn't move away, he moved through. What they all agree on, 1 second Chen's strike was traveling toward a target, the next second there was no target. And in the half-second that Chen's momentum carried him forward, that microscopic window where his weight was committed, his body extended, his balance borrowed from physics he could no longer renegotiate, Bruce Lee hit him. Not a dramatic, swinging Hollywood strike, one strike, compact, precise, delivered from a distance of maybe 6 inches, using a principle that Bruce had spent a decade refining, that power didn't require wind-up, that force could be generated from almost nothing, that the human body contained the capacity for explosive energy at any range if you understood how to unlock it. The sound it made was not the sound of a movie punch. It was a real sound, the kind of sound that makes everyone in a room simultaneously understand that something serious has just occurred. Chen Wei-dong, 999 victories, 22 years of training, 6 feet 2, 235 pounds of stone wall, went backwards. Not stumbling, not staggering, backwards. His feet left the floor briefly. He hit the wall behind him with his shoulder blades and slid down it in a controlled but involuntary descent until he was seated on the floor, his legs out in front of him, his expression doing something that none of his companions had ever seen it do. Confusion. Pure structural confusion. The confusion of a man whose entire understanding of physical reality has just been revised without his permission. 3 seconds. From Chen's launch to Chen against the wall. 3 seconds. Nobody spoke. This is the detail that every witness returned to. Not the strike itself, not the sound, not Chen on the floor. The silence afterwards. Because Chen's companions were large, trained men who had spent years operating in environments where violence was currency. They were not the kind of men who were easily shocked into silence, but they were silent. Raymond Cho stood against the wall and did not move. Later he said, "I have watched fighters my entire life. I knew the moment Chen launched, it was already over." Bruce had been waiting. He had let Chen come, and then it was like watching someone turn off a machine. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the room. He hadn't moved far from where he started. He was breathing normally. His expression was exactly what it had been when they arrived, that deep, quiet water. He looked at Chen on the floor, not with contempt, not with triumph, with something closer to patience, the way a teacher looks at a student who has just made an important mistake and is beginning to understand it. Chen Wei-dong sat against the wall for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. When he finally stood, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man taking inventory of himself, he said nothing. He straightened his jacket, he looked at Chen, and something moved across his face, something private that he took with him when he walked out of that room. He never spoke publicly about that night. His companions never spoke about it either, but they told people, because that's what happens with moments like this. They're too large to hold privately, so they leak out in whispered conversations, in late-night training sessions, in the specific way a man lowers his voice when he wants you to understand that what he's about to say is real.
The story moved the way all forbidden things move. Not loudly, not in newspapers, not in public announcements or official records. It moved in whispers. It moved through the narrow corridors of Kowloon's martial arts schools, slipping from mouth to ear like smoke finding cracks in a wall. It moved through the closed-door conversations of men who had spent their lives believing they understood the hierarchy of combat and were now, quietly, privately, recalculating everything. By the following morning, 3 people who weren't in that room already knew what had happened. By the end of the week, 30 did. By the end of the month, the number was uncountable. But here's what's strange. Here's what makes this particular story different from the way rumors usually inflate and distort as they travel. The story didn't grow. It stayed exactly the same, every version, every retelling, as if the truth of it was so precise, so specific, so complete, that there was nothing to exaggerate. Reality had already done the work. Chen Wei-dong had launched. Bruce Lee had moved. 1 strike, 3 seconds. Stone wall on the floor. That was the whole story, and it was enough. Chen's 999 victories didn't disappear overnight. That's not how reputation works. Reputation is architecture, built over years, load-bearing, structural. You can't demolish it in a single evening, not officially, not publicly. But something changed. The men who had fought under Chen's banner, who had trained in his system, who had staked their own identities on the belief that raw power compounded over decades was the ultimate answer, those men started asking questions they hadn't asked before. Quiet questions, private ones. How did he hit Chen from that distance? Why didn't Chen see it coming? What kind of training produces that? These weren't the questions of men abandoning their beliefs. They were the questions of men whose beliefs had developed a crack, thin as a hairline, but structural. The kind of crack that if you press on it, changes everything. Chen himself retreated. Not dramatically, not visibly. He didn't close his school or stop teaching. He didn't disappear from the circuits. But those who knew him closely, who had spent years reading the temperature of his confidence, said something had shifted behind his eyes. Some certainty that had always been there, as permanent as furniture, was gone. He fought twice more in the following year, won both, but his companions said the fights looked different, more cautious, more conservative, as if some part of Chen's mind was now permanently occupied by a question it couldn't resolve. One of those companions, a man named Fong who had been in the room that night, said something years later that stayed with the few who heard it. Chen never recovered from the speed, not the pain, not the loss, the speed. He told me once, months after, he said, "I threw that punch and I thought it was going to land. I was certain. I have never been certain of anything the way I was certain of that punch." He paused. Then he said, "That's what frightened me, that my certainty meant nothing." Bruce Lee never mentioned it, not to reporters, not in interviews, not in his private journals that were later published, not in his letters. There exists no written record from Bruce himself of the events of that evening in Kowloon. This is consistent with everything those who knew him have said about his character. Bruce Lee did not collect victories the way other men did, pinned to the wall of identity like hunting trophies to be displayed and pointed to when someone questioned your worth. He wasn't built that way. The win was never the point. The win was simply the evidence. Evidence of a principle, evidence of a philosophy that he had been refining since the day he first understood that the martial arts he'd been taught were only the beginning of a much larger question. His student Dan Inansato, one of the people closest to Bruce during the years that followed, spoke often about this quality, about how Bruce processed confrontation. He wasn't interested in proving he was better. He was interested in proving the idea was better. That's a different thing. One is ego. The other is science. Bruce Lee was conducting science. Every confrontation, every challenge, every moment where his principles were tested against the weight and power and training of men who outmassed him by 50, 70, 100 pounds. These were experiments, data, refinements. And what the Kowloon room gave him, what Chen Weidong's 999 victories and 22 years of power building gave him, was the clearest possible test case. Mass is real. Power is real. Training is real. And against the right principles, they are not enough.
Here is what Bruce understood that Chen didn't. What he had been building toward since he left Hong Kong for Seattle as a young man, since he spent years dismantling everything he thought he knew about fighting and rebuilding it from the ground up, with the precision of someone who refused to accept inherited wisdom without interrogating every single piece of it. Power without speed is a prediction, and predictions can be escaped. The human body, even the most trained human body, even the most powerful, requires time. Time to generate force, time to commit, time to travel the distance between intention and impact. And within that time, no matter how small, there is a window. Bruce Lee spent his life making himself small enough to fit through that window. His 1-inch punch, the technique that mystified audiences when he demonstrated it publicly, that sent grown men stumbling backward from what appeared to be almost no movement at all, wasn't a trick. It wasn't showmanship. It was the visible expression of a principle he had internalized so completely that it had become biological. He had trained his body to generate explosive force from structural position alone. No wind-up, no telegraph, no warning. He had eliminated prediction from his striking. And a strike you cannot predict is a strike you cannot defend. Chen's entire system, 999 victories deep, was built on the assumption that there would be time. Time to read, time to position, time to respond. Every man he had ever faced had given him that time, because every man he had ever faced was working within the normal parameters of human speed. Bruce Lee was not working within normal parameters. He had exited them deliberately through obsessive, singular, almost inhuman dedication. He trained forearm speed when other men trained power. He trained explosive release when other men trained endurance. He studied the physics of impact the way engineers study load-bearing structures, not intuitively but analytically, adjusting variables, testing outcomes, discarding what didn't work. He had built himself into something the existing martial arts vocabulary didn't have a word for. The rumors that circulated through Hong Kong in the months after that night settled, eventually, into something more durable than rumor. They settled into legend. And legend, unlike rumor, doesn't require witnesses. It doesn't require documentation. It requires only that the truth at its center is large enough to sustain the weight of the story wrapped around it. This one was, because the story of Chen Wei-dong and the 7 witnesses and the 3 seconds in a Kowloon gymnasium wasn't really about Bruce Lee defeating a powerful man. It was about something that frightened people more deeply than physical defeat. It was about a man who had spent 22 years building an empire of certainty, an unassailable fortress of size, training, and accumulated victory, walking into a room and discovering that the fortress had a door he'd never seen, and that someone had already found it. That's the story that spread. That's the story that survived. Because every fighter who heard it recognized something in it. Every man who had spent years adding layers to his fighting system, adding mass to his frame, adding victories to his record, every one of them heard this story and felt somewhere quiet in themselves the hairline crack. What if there's a door I haven't seen? Years later, after Enter the Dragon had made Bruce Lee's face recognizable on every continent, after the films, the interviews, the global phenomenon, after Bruce was no longer a whispered name in Kowloon, but a permanent fixture in the mythology of the 20th century, a journalist asked one of his longtime training partners a question. The journalist said, "What made Bruce Lee different?" "Not in the films, in reality." The training partner thought for a moment. He said, "Most fighters fight the opponent in front of them. Bruce fought the version of the opponent who was about to make their best move. He was always one step into the future, and by the time you arrived at the present, he was already somewhere else." The journalist wrote that down. Then the training partner said something the journalist almost didn't include in the article because it sounded too simple, too plain, too small for the weight of the man it described. He said, "Bruce always told us, the goal is not to hit hard. The goal is to hit true. Chen Wei-dong hit hard his whole career. Bruce hit true, and true is faster than hard. True always arrives first." Chen Wei-dong retired from the fighting circuits in 1969. He opened a small school in the New Territories, taught for 30 years. His students said he was a brilliant teacher, patient, precise, deeply knowledgeable. They said he spoke often about the importance of humility, about how the best fighters were the ones who stayed empty, who never let their victories fill them so full there was no room left for learning. They didn't know why he said this so often. They didn't know about the room in Kowloon, or the 7 witnesses, or the 3 seconds. But they felt the weight of it in the way he taught, in the way he paused sometimes mid-demonstration, as if remembering something he couldn't name. He died in 2003. He was 81 years old. In his desk drawer, his family found a single index card, handwritten, 3 lines in traditional Chinese characters. Translated, they read, "Speed is not something you chase. It is something you become. Power without truth is only noise. The wall that cannot be moved must learn first to be still." No one knows if he wrote it himself. No one knows if those words came from somewhere else, something he'd read or heard in the decades after that night in Kowloon. But his family kept the card, and the people who saw it, who knew the story, who understood what it meant, they said the same thing without needing to coordinate it. They said, "He never forgot."
Bruce Lee died in July 1973. He was 32 years old. He left behind films. He left behind books, notes, philosophical writings that fill volumes. He left behind a system, Jeet Kune Do, that wasn't a style, but an anti-style, a philosophy that said, discard what is useless, keep only what works, be like water, formless, adaptive, able to become the shape of any container without losing the essential nature of what you are. He left behind something else too. He left behind a question, the same question that cracked Chen Wei-dong's certainty in a Kowloon gymnasium,
the same question that haunted every large man, every powerful man, every man who had spent years assembling his fighting identity like armor, who then heard this story and felt the hairline fracture begin. The question was this: what do you do when what you've built isn't enough? Bruce Lee's answer, his life's answer, distilled to its simplest form, was you stop building walls, you start becoming water. Because walls can be found, walls have doors, walls eventually crumble under the weight of their own rigidity. But water? Water doesn't have a door. Water doesn't commit to one shape. Water finds the fastest path, the truest path, regardless of what's in the way, and it arrives before anything built from stone even finishes deciding how to respond. Chen Wei-dong had 999 victories. He was the stone wall. And on a quiet night in Kowloon, in a gymnasium lit by 3 overhead lights, with 7 witnesses and no cameras and no record, the water arrived. 3 seconds later, the wall understood something it had never understood before: that stone is heavy, and heavy is slow, and slow, when faced with something that has made itself into pure truth, pure speed, pure intention, slow loses. It always has. It always will. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Bruce Lee. That's the story they never put in the history books. The confrontation with no footage, no official record, no name in any archive. But 7 men were in that room, and the truth they witnessed was bigger than any camera could have captured. Because some moments don't need to be recorded to be real. They just need to be true. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think differently about strength, speed, and what it means to truly master something, hit subscribe. Every week, we go searching for the stories history forgot to tell, the hidden moments, the quiet rooms where legends were made. Subscribe, because the best stories were never in the textbooks.